Hello, my name is Christopher Fogel, and I am the Health and Human Sciences educator with Purdue Extension-Decatur County. And today we're going to talk about, are you prepared for the unexpected? And the unexpected in this scenario is going to be something that is either a man-made or a natural disaster, and how you respond to that as an individual or even as a family. So my first question to you would be, what would you do if your basic services like water, gas, electricity, or communication were suddenly cut off? Do you have a plan? Is that something that you have kind of prepared for, to know when those amenities are shut off, what would you do in your house? Now, compile that with the idea that not only have your amenities been shut off, but you've also just been informed that you need to evacuate the location that you were at. What do you do? Do you feel nervous now thinking about you might not be prepared? Because that's something that, even though we don't want to think about it, my rule of thumb is plan for the worst and hope for the best. Because in the event that a man-made or a natural disaster occurs, it's something that a lot of times we're not prepared. And whenever we think about people that aren't prepared, there are actually studies that show this. And, it's something that we should ask ourselves all the time. Because a recent Federal Emergency Management Agency survey found that 60% of American adults have not practiced what to do in a disaster. And this includes people that haven't practiced, that are maybe do have a survival kit, or those individuals that just haven't practiced any kind of response at all. And this is something that we run into all the time, where there's all these recommendations in place for a reason. You need to have 72 hours of amenities. Well, the 72 hours isn't just an arbitrary number. The 72 hours is there because it takes, on average, 72 hours for the federal government to respond to a natural disaster, to supply aid in some level. So, all things are put into purpose because of some kind of study. So we're going to kind of walk through what that looks like and how to be better prepared as an individual. So as we talk about the steps to preparedness, there are 4 just common goals. Gather emergency supplies is one. Collect copies of important documents is another. Develop emergency response and communication plans. And then ultimately just being informed. And we're going to go over each one of those in the coming slides, and we're just going to kind of break one by one down and just really investigate what each one of those means. So whenever we talk about supply kits and being prepared, these go by multiple names. There are things called supply kits that are jump bags. There are things that are different kinds of survival kits. There's go bags. They go by all sorts of names, but they all have the same common theme. It's something that's going to help you survive in a moment of disaster. So the goal is to have at least 72 hours worth of provisions, whether that be a mobile bag or if that's a survival kit, which would be more of a stationary kit at your house. So what do 72 hours worth of provisions look like? As far as water is concerned, having at least 3 gallons of water for each person. So this would be 1 gallon per day. That is, in a survival situation, what we would want. And 1 gallon would break down to what our daily recommended amount would be. Our food would need to be non-perishable items, again, looking at kind of that 72-hour necessity. And then the last one is air. So whenever we think about air, we need filtered masks or an alternative to a filtered mask. So these would be things like N95 masks. Some people have asked me before about, well, can't I just wear a surgical mask in the event of a disaster? Surgical masks are constructed in a way that it is to stop organisms and particulate from exiting your mouth and entering the ambient air. So it's helping stop you from breathing your particulate into the air, where it does nothing to stop particulate being inhaled through it. N95 masks, on the other hand, are the opposite, where it's stopping particulate from you breathing it in. So those emergent supplies that you need really focus on the 3 main factors we need to survive, which are water, food, and air. So again, 3 gallons of water, non-perishable food, and air. So looking at filtration systems, even for your house, having extra filters to put into your own internal air supply system, whatever that might look like. Then we look at medications and medical supplies. So include at least a week's worth of prescriptions if possible. So this is something you could discuss with a physician to say, I'm putting together a survival kit. Is there any way I can get maybe an extra week's worth to include in that? Just because sometimes if we store our medications in a cabinet, if we need to evacuate immediately, we're not going to think, I need to go to my medicine cabinet and get out all of my medications. It's going to be you need to grab your bag and go. So having some of those medications or medical supplies, a first aid kit, would be a very great asset to have in your medical supply for your emergency supply kit. Then I kind of already mentioned it, but consider having two different kits. So in the event that there's an emergency that happens, you could either be evacuated or you could shelter in place. So one of those kits would be a stationary kit that's maintained in your residence. It's somewhere easily accessible in a coat closet, by a door, and it's something that's going to stay at your house. Even in a basement is a great place, because a lot of times in Indiana, specifically during tornado season, whenever the inclement weather's in place, we go to the basement. Then you should also have a to-go bag, and this is maintained for evacuation. So utilize a container that's on wheels if possible, or a backpack, something that's going to be easy for you to be mobile with. So your to-go bag, obviously you're not going to be able to carry as much with you, but keep in mind of those essential things: water, food, and air. Like, you may not be able to carry 3 gallons of water with you, but having extra water is as important as anything. So then our last point, as I've kind of already mentioned again, is storing those kits in easily accessible areas. If you have a go bag and you need to evacuate, having it stored in a tote in the garage where you have to get out a ladder and get it out, that's not going to do you any good, because when you get evacuated, you need to go. So I recommend having these hang on a hall tree, maybe next to an entrance door, having it setting next to an entrance door or an exit door, somewhere where you can easily get to it. Same with the stationary kits. If it's in a basement, it's in an easily accessible area where it might be a location in the basement where you know that your entire family is going to evacuate to in your own house. So these are just some examples of different jump bags that they have. You can buy them prepared already. So you see here in this slide, there are some 5-gallon buckets that have prepared stuff in it, but you can also make your own. Everybody's supply kit is subjective to what they want and need, because my needs are different than your needs, and they're different from anybody else's. There's also a bag here where you see a cute dog. You're not the only person that you need to think of in times of emergency. They are your dependent at that point. So having amenities for your pets is just as important as having it for yourself and anybody else in your household. So as you can see, your kit can be as big or as little as what you want it to be, but trying to be as prepared as possible is the key. So within your supply kits, one of the things that's also important to think about is keeping copies of important documents. These again are going to be completely subjective to each family. An important document to one family might not be an important document to another family. And I say copies because, we hope that if you have the actual primary copy of it, the original copy, that it's put up somewhere that it's not going to be damaged. So in a bank box, in some sort of vault, or a case, but just have the copies, because if you're evacuated, it's something that you can have that to show identity, you can show insurance, all kinds of things. And you can see in the table at the bottom of the slide, I've included some different things that are potential for important documents: family records, your social security number or your social security card copies, prescription list, driver's license, medical records, wills, deeds, medical cards, again, pet medical records. These are all things that, in the event. So whenever the Katrina hit Louisiana, a lot of those individuals were actually transported to the Astrodome. And to have some form of identification was huge, because you were able to prove you are who you are. Because in moments of disaster is whenever we see a spike in a lot of individuals that take advantage of others, where we have identity crisis and we have identity theft and we have all kinds of things. But if you're able to maintain some level of identity by having these copies in your supply kits, that's huge. Because let's say that the original does get destroyed in a emergency, you at least have a copy of it that you can reference, and you can show proof of who you are, of your bank accounts, of different things like that, deeds, tax records, and so on and so forth. So having copies of important documents in those are important. And you can also see that, if possible, store them in a waterproof container or in some kind of waterproof liner, just because if you are mobile and you're evacuated and let's say it's raining, that's going to be important to keep those from getting wet because you don't know what's going to happen. It's kind of, again, that plan for the worst, hope for the best scenario. So now we have our supply kits. We know we are going to be set on our supplies. We've got copies of our emergency documents. Now we need to think about our emergency response plans. So an emergency response plan or plans are just how are we going to respond to an emergency, whether that be tornado or earthquake, fire, financial emergency. Maybe it's something where we're evacuated. We should think about all of those scenarios and have an idea of what our response is going to look like. So, what that looks like is meet with your family, friends, or social network and coordinate efforts to standardize responses. If you live in some sort of apartment building, what is the response in the apartment building? Maybe have a neighbor, work with them. Just identify what a response is going to look like as far as how are you going to plan if something were to happen. So what you do at that time too is you assess yourself and your household. And what this is that you're identifying your personal abilities or your limitations. If somebody has the ability to drive and maybe your neighbor doesn't, that's somewhere where you could standardize that effort. If you evacuate, you help them out, or vice versa. Or if you have some physical limitations, what is that going to look like? How are you going to evacuate yourself? So evaluating that and assessing what do your limitations and abilities look like and plan that into those responses. Then create a communication plan. Identify who and how you will communicate. Some people really like text. Some people really like a phone call. What does that look like? How are you going to communicate those that you need to communicate? And in the event of an emergency, you should only have a short list of people that you communicate with, just because you're going to be on the move, or it's going to be very strenuous of what's happening at that time. So having that list and how you'll communicate with them is really important. Then be aware of your community's disaster response plan. So every community has, for the most part, an emergency management agency director and an emergency management agency that already has community-wide response plans in place. So just being aware of what that looks like and what they've already identified as potential risk in your community is huge, because they can help you jumpstart what should I be planning for? How should I be planning for it? If I need help at getting evacuated, is there help available? Or I would like to volunteer to help if that were the case. So being aware of that is really key, and identifying what is at risk. What are those hazards that could potentially take place in my community? So here's just an example, because I do question sometimes about, I still don't understand what are their different response plans. So these are two very similar scenarios, but they're very different as well. We have a shelter in place and we have evacuation. A shelter in place ultimately means if the authorities came out and said that your specific community or area needs a shelter in place, it means that you need to stay where you are at that point in time. You are not allowed to leave your residence for the most part. So in this particular response plans, you would want to have your emergency supply kit in a designated area where you know it's going to be in your residence. Then you'll want to look at your communication plan. How will you communicate with your family when you shelter in place, because you're not able to leave your residence? Then you're going to look at possibly having supplies available to seal a room if air is contaminated. For instance, some counties and communities have railroad tracks that flow through, and that railroad may carry chlorine gas on certain rail cars. If that were to derail and there was a release of chlorine gas, you would want to seal your residence if you were in the affected area, just so then that contaminant doesn't get on. Then you would want to look at turning your HVAC systems off if applicable, because you wouldn't want to pull that outside air in. So those are the things to think about in shelter in place. Versely, if we look at evacuation, you want to store that emergency supply kit in an easily accessible exit area where as you leave, you can take it. And instead of communicating with family, you may have a rendezvous point with them where you don't even worry about calling them. You're just more worried about, I'm going to get to point A, which is our rendezvous point. And when everybody gets there, then you move on. As far as the filter is concerned here, you're going to have some sort of filter mask. Again, an N95 is kind of that standard for what that looks like. And then as you leave, you're going to lock your residence. Locking your residence in this scenario is one of the key parts to helping with securing your other belongings, because again, what happens in response plans is that this gets overlooked, and unfortunately we do have individuals that go in during an emergency and they will loot and rob. So it's something to kind of take into consideration. So these are just ways that some of those plans can be different ultimately. So we know that we need to have a communication plan, but what does that look like to different people? So this is, again, emergency planning is so subjective, and it can be fun because you get to create how you're going to respond. So coordinate how you'll communicate with everyone in different scenarios. So you may have some people in your family that they only want to have a phone call or a text, or it's social media, or it's a rendezvous point, whatever that might look like. My biggest thing is, identifying those family contacts. Who are you going to contact? Is it family? It could be friends, or it could be somebody from your church. It's, something where you know that you're going to contact somebody. Then you could also have those in case of emergency contacts. So these are ICE. So an emergency plan could also be if there's a medical event. In my cell phone, I have ICE planned into my phone where if a responder were to get my phone, they could easily look up ICE, call it, and it would be somebody that I've already predetermined to be, that's my emergency contact. The third bullet point, out of town contact. This is probably the most important bullet out of this piece, because in the instance that there is let's say, a major issue where there's a tornado that went through, everybody's going to be trying to call everybody in town. And this is going to bog down cell phone towers and different things like that. So having an out-of-town contact, so maybe your cousin lives in another state, say Florida. Maybe that is the contact in your communication plan that when something happens, everybody in the family needs to call Chris in Florida, because your cell phone service is going to be much easier to call out of town to another state and let them know, hey, we're good. If anybody else calls, let them know that we're good too. So identifying that out-of-town contact is just as important. Then also identify what those emergency services numbers are. Police departments, fire, EMA, medical service numbers are also important, where paramedics, your physician, if you have any kind of other health practitioner that you see on a regular basis, having those available as well, just because you may need those in that instance where you need to contact them to have a question about prescriptions or your own medical care. What should you do? Have an advisement. So, identifying those in your communication plan is important. How are you going to do it? Who's going to be involved? And then what and when are kind of the breakdown of that communication plan. So we've kind of went through, we've talked about, how we need to have our supply kits. We've talked about having copies of our important documents, what our communication and response plans look like. And ultimately, we also need to be informed. Identify what hazards threaten your community and neighborhood. Not all communities are apples to apples. It's a lot of times apples to oranges. If you live out west, the emergency response is going to look vastly different there as planning goes as compared to in Indiana. Make a list of how things might affect you. Think about both natural and human caused disasters. Identify how you might be notified of a possible emergency. So, having a weather radio or some kind of emergency radio available where even if towers go down, you still can get reception into that to let you know what's going on. So identifying evacuation routes in your community, that's huge. They are predetermined, and again, this is where you could contact your local EMA and talk with them, and they would help you identify what those look like. And then be aware. If you have the ability to help inform others, do it. We should all be helping each other out, because you don't know who in your community may need extra assistance, because we don't oftentimes ask for help. So it's good to just reach out and say, hey, I'm planning for this. Do you want to be involved in it? It's something that is a great way to network, and it's a great way to make it fun as well, where once a month you're going to practice maybe meeting up at your rendezvous point, and then you're going to go out for dinner after. It seems very trivial, but it's something that it's practiced, and at the end of it you're going to have a conversation, and then when time comes, what's going to happen. So really, too, whenever we look at our kits, they need to be maintained as well. So every 6 months, check your disaster supplies. Some of them have expiration dates on them. Your water and your food should be changed out every 6 months. Looking at that, some stuff could be up to a year potentially, but 6 months is kind of the rule of thumb. Having ID tags on your kits. So this is really, really big. Again, going back to Katrina, one of the things that happened at some level is that people had bags and they didn't have ID on them, and then it would get lost. Or, when you have thousands and thousands of people, it's just an easy way to identify that. So name, phone number, home address, just some identifiers that it's easily done. Then again, it's a broken record. Review and test your response and communication plans for effectiveness. It might even be where you take your go bag with you and you use some of the supplies that you have if it's at the end of 6 months, just so then you're even practice with your supplies as well. It's something that at 6 months, if the expiration date is going to come and go, well, it's a good time to practice with it because you're going to need to get new anyway. And then once a year too, again, batteries, that's one of those things that once a year changes out. That could even be every 6 months. So looking at those flashlights, radios, fire alarms, those are things that need to be checked once a year for functionality. And lastly, just to kind of wrap it up, this is a lot of information to take in. It's something that, again, 60% of people in America don't plan for. But when disaster strikes, really, if you see something, say something. Even if it's just reporting inclement weather, if you have a questionable call and you think it could be a scam and it's something, it could be a financial disaster, report that. Or even if you're evacuating and you see behavior that you feel is maybe illegal, where somebody is potentially breaking into buildings, report that. That's stuff that during a disaster, it's important to all be together and work together. Be aware of financial exploitation scams following a major disaster. This is where, so I know that in my particular county, a huge hailstorm went through a couple years ago, and it was within hours of the hailstorm going through that there were dent fixing operations and construction crews all over my county. And there are certain groups that will follow storms, and they're doing it for financial gain. One of the things that happens is that some insurance companies will not reimburse unless you have it assessed first, approved, and then turned in. What these individuals are doing is they're coming in and they're trying to get fast money. But also what happens too is that you run into issues where people will try and gain your personal information to help you out in the moment of crisis as well, which then we have financial downfall, potential for identity theft, and the list goes on and on. But just being aware of that is important. And then, two, when it comes to disaster, be prepared to adapt and overcome. It's something that no disaster is ever the same. It's always different. You can only plan for what you are going to expect, but you can't plan for what actually is going to happen. So you have to adapt and overcome. And being extremely fluid is important, because if you're rigid and you think, this is how I plan, this is the way it needs to be, that is just a combination for failure. And it just needs to be where you just go with the flow, really. Again, kind of going on, we have authorities that are trained also that are going to be looking for the greater population. So listen for their directions. Listen to what they're telling you and follow them the best you can. It's something that if you need to evacuate, evacuate. If they need you to shelter in place, and just follow their lead. Here's a good point too to also comment that if a disaster happens and everything passes everything is good in your world, wait for the direction again as well, because they're trying to figure out how are they going to respond to areas that are affected. We as humans are great at volunteering and wanting to help, but until they ask for help, just hang out and let them tell you. One of the issues that happens whenever there are major natural disasters is that people begin sending aid right away. They'll send down semis full of food and clothes, and might even be volunteers that show up to an area of a disaster for help. And that is one of the worst things that can possibly happen, because what needs to happen first is that those first responders need to evaluate what needs to happen, what needs do they actually have, and do they need food, water, and stuffed animals or clothes, whatever it might be, to have to help those that were affected by it. Because what happens with a lot of natural disasters is these supplies show up and then they get stored in a warehouse where they never get used, because they didn't need them. So listening for those directions from your local authorities is going to be key, not only for response for your own safety, but a response for, volunteer as well. And most of all, stay calm, be patient, and think before you act. It's something that you won't be alone in the response, but getting excited about it is only going to make things worse. Trying to stay as calm as you possibly can and just wait for things to happen. Because even though first responders are trained, they have to evaluate what's going on first and make sure everybody's safety is most important. So those are just some things to kind of think about as you personally are setting up for your own response plans, your supply kits, thinking about what are those important documents to you and your family. I've supplied some resources here. This fifth resource that's from the Red Cross, I think this is a great resource. It's a PDF. It's for seniors by seniors, but I think this is probably one of the best response planning guides that's out there, and I think it should just be, Red Cross planning for preparedness. It doesn't need to be for seniors by seniors because everything is applicable in there. So I appreciate you taking the time to listen to me today, and I will see you on the flip side. Thanks.